Hey everybody, welcome to Finding Faith in Fairytales. If you didn't get a chance to tune in on Wednesday night or you didn't get to join us in person, here's the recording. As you know, we've been really looking forward to doing the Lenten soup suppers together for the last few years and been unable to because of COVID, and we're stoked to be able to do it this year. And you know, if you know anything about me, you know that I love C.S. Lewis. I love the Chronicles of Narnia. And so when Derek gave me the opportunity to speak with you all and share with you all this year, I was really pumped. So I'm going to do my best not to go overboard. And I need everybody here, everyone from all around the world, all around Sewickley, wherever you might be tuning into this. If you've heard Derek lead us for the last few years in the Lenten Soup Suppers, you know how much he's just an expert at that. And that's great. But I'm going to need everybody to collectively lower the bar. I'm not Derek Davenport. And that's just part of it. And Derek's great. But we're going to do our best. And I'm going to try to have some dramatic questions in my presentations the way that Derek would. But hopefully we can all take this opportunity to really dive deeply into the world of Narnia, because I think it's so much more than something we label just as a children's story, but rather it's just something beautiful. It's a beautiful way for us to go into our faith. So enough preamble. Let me just get into it with you all. So first, some background on C.S. Lewis. If there you can see him right next to me. I have a better beard and we have a similar hairline. So some background on Lewis. Lewis was one of the most significant theologians of the 20th century. He was a teacher, a professor in Oxford. He was a preacher at different times, and he was also theologian. Some would call him a lay leader in the church, but he was a major thinker and contributor. Now, he's far more popular now than he was when he was alive, but nonetheless, Lewis's work has been some of the most important work in Christian thought in the last 100+ years. Now, my first interaction with Lewis and his work came when I was in middle school. Now, that's a long, long story of how I first encountered Lewis. It's a fun story, kind of. We can talk about another time. But what's important is that when I first encountered Lewis's work, it was actually Mere Christianity and the Screwtape Letters. Now, if you've read Mere Christianity, which is a great piece of work, the purpose of Mere Christianity is to lay out what is the faith. Now, Lewis was drafted and served in World War I and almost got drafted again for World War II. He just missed the cutoff. And so, I mean, a man that lived through both of those wars, lost so many friends to those battles. I mean, you can imagine the kind of impact and toll that takes on someone in their life. Mere Christianity was originally actually a radio broadcast, and he was approached to ask and ask if he would be able to help inspire people and give them a reason to believe. And so the whole purpose of Mere Christianity was to help explain why the faith was still a reasonable route to go in our life, despite all of these terrible things happening in the world around us. Seems very potent for the current situation we find ourselves in March of 2022. Not too far around the world, there's a war going on. There are people wondering, is there a God? Is there a reason for us to believe these things when everything else around us is in shambles? Lewis lived through that and worked through that and sought to help others think through those things. Now, Mere Christianity, when it was transcribed into a book, became this huge resource. In fact, I didn't even know about the Chronicles of Narnia originally. I'd only heard of Mere Christianity, and I loved it. And I didn't understand everything in it. Some of you are going to be like, wow, in 8th grade? Like, okay, just because I read it doesn't mean I got it. But it's an impressive work. But the downside to this is that I thought I was too far above reading the Chronicles of Narnia. Like, why do I need to read children's stories if I understand Lewis's, prime, most popular, thoughtful, scholarly work? That was a mistake, and I'm glad I overcame that in college. The Chronicles of Narnia, though, overall are some of the most impactful pieces of work I've ever read, from Lewis or from anyone else. And they're disguised as children's novels. They're disguised as fairy tales. And I hope that over the next few weeks together throughout Lent, but even beyond that, we can see the impact that not only the Chronicles of Narnia will have on our faith, but any story that we allow ourselves to dive into. And so just a few overarching ideas that really captured Lewis's thought and work is that Lewis's entire perspective of the world was through the lens of rationality, or our ability to reason, capital R, like this Platonic idea of what it means to think the way that we're always intended to, and also this romanticism of seeing the world through this lens that's not just purely logical, purely put into boxes, but rather seeing how the beauty takes place in the world around us. So he was truly a romantic in the way that he wrote and approached literature and life and work. And so his work is this pairing of faith and reason. And faith, in a very large way, to Lewis, would be the work of the romantic. It's not purely logical, but logic's not the enemy either. We have to understand that these things are not diametrically opposed, but rather they work together to give us a full life. And so, just a few brief points about methodology. One is that we're only going to be doing 5 books together because we only have 5 weeks. So we're going to skip The Horse and His Boy, which is my least favorite of the 7. We're going to skip The Last Battle, which is amazing, but it's last. So it just was the logical one to skip. I really hope we do a good enough job together that you'll go and read that on your own. But that kind of brings up the next point, is that we're going to go in release order rather than chronological order. So all my Star Wars people out there that are talking about which order to watch, this is the order. The point being, if you look at certain publications, they're going to tell you specifically that The Magician's Nephew comes first. That is not how we're going to approach this. I really hope you didn't already read it. I think that the way that Lewis released this, originally Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is what we're doing today, was going to be the only Narnia adventure. And later he decided to expand it into 7. But I think there's a lot of power in how the story unfolds to revisit the beginning later. And so there's a long soapbox. I'm not going to get on about that any further, but I hope that you'll be able to see the payoff of going in the release order, starting with Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. Next is that the Narnia movies never happened. I know some of you are totally offended by this, and that's okay. We can all have our opinions. For the sake of the next 5 weeks, the only thing the Narnia movies are going to bring into our discussion are some fun pictures to use for visual aids. And I'll poke fun at some of them, and I'll be gracious to some of them. So if you thought that's what we're going to do, we're not. And just like in 3rd grade, when you thought you could watch the movie instead of reading the book, you can't. So I expect you guys won't be cheating the assignment by watching the movies. And finally, as we talk about Lewis, I love Lewis's work. It's so impactful, and it's so drawing upon scripture all throughout. And so as a result of that, I want to make sure I'm pointing out some of those pieces to you. Sometimes we'll stop and actually have a discussion about that. Sometimes it's just going to be kind of a throwaway comment for you to chew on your own. And I'm also going to draw on some of other pieces of Lewis's work. So some of those, again, we're going to stop, pause on, talk about, and some we're just going to keep moving. So I just want to put that on your radar, put that in the back of your mind as we continue. But without further ado, let's get started with the true first Chronicle of Narnia, which is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This series is called Finding Faith in Fairytales, and this is the dedication to this first novel, which is to Lewis's goddaughter. I just want to read it to you real quick. I wrote this story for you, but when I began it, I had not realized that girls grow quicker than books. As a result, you're already too old for fairy tales, and by the time it's printed and bound, you'll be older still. But someday, you'll be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. You can then take it down from some upper shelf, dust it, and tell me what you think of it. I shall probably be too deaf to hear and too old to understand a word you say, but I shall still be your affectionate godfather, C.S. Lewis. Hopefully, we can have the humility to recognize that we're old enough to read fairy tales again. Hopefully, we can see that there is value in the way these stories impact us. The power in any story is the way that it can evoke emotion from us. It can draw in our own experience into the experiences of characters we see, and that can be in the most dramatic sense of the word, in maybe your favorite film that you've gone to the movies to see, or in a children's novel. I think the delegations of saying something is for children and not for children is really detrimental to our own ability to let these characters do their work on us the way they were intended. And so, The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's the first of the 7 Chronicles, and it's the idea that was originally inspired all this time ago by this lamppost that Lewis used to see near his office. And so this is actually the lamppost. You can see it right above my head there, that he would see, and he just imagined it in a forest filled with snow where a lamppost shouldn't be, and he imagined a fawn under a tree. And so that this is actually the original image that Lewis was thinking about. Let's see if I did that right. Yeah. That he was thinking about, what that inspired this first novel. And so the story follows the family of the Pevenses, Peter, the oldest, then Susan, Edmund, and then Lucy, the youngest. And it's this story that's taking place during war times. The kids are sent to an old professor's house for the summer to escape the air raids from the war. And it's there that they start to explore the property. And one day, Lucy goes into the spare room at the end of a hall and sees that it's empty except for a giant wardrobe. She goes through the wardrobe, and to her surprise, she finds she's no longer amongst coats, but in the magical land of Narnia. And so it begins with Lucy and Mr. Tumnus. Again, there's that photo there. And when she meets Mr. Tumnus, the fawn, at the lamppost, he misunderstands her initially, and he thinks she's from the strange country of Spare Oom. He meant spare room. But as they begin to talk, Lucy goes on a little walk, and she keeps saying, well, just for a few moments, just for a few moments. And before she knows it, hours go by. And she's having tea with Mr. Tumnus at his house, and he begins to cry bitterly. And she's trying to console him, and finally he confesses that he is in employment from the White Witch. She's the person that makes it always winter and never Christmas in Narnia. Now, again, you have to put yourself in the mindset of your youngest, purest self. The idea of winter without Christmas is pretty detrimental. Even if there's no gifts associated with Christmas, what else is associated with Christmas, right? It's the music, it's the decorations, it's the food that you eat, it's the family that comes to visit. It's a time of celebration and presents. Okay. So if we say there's a winter without Christmas, then what's the point of winter anymore? Especially for a small child. So this is one of those images that Lewis is using, trying to set the tone of like what is actually happening. Narnia is supposed to be this beautiful, magical place, but it's been robbed of its value, of its meaning, because it's now just a desolate winter without Christmas. And so Lucy pleads with Mr. Tumnus, please let me go. Please don't turn me into the White Witch. And finally, after pleading with him, he agrees and he takes her back to the lamppost. Now, the big piece of this that he names is that if he doesn't capture her, if he lets her go, then he's surely going to be arrested and turned to stone, as the White Witch is known to do. But he ultimately makes the decision to let her go. And this is like a really big allusion, I think, to Esther chapter 4. If you remember the story of Esther, the Jews are at risk of annihilation. And Mordecai goes to his niece Esther and says, please go to the king and go on our behalf and advocate for us. And Esther's response is, if I go to the king, I will die. And Mordecai goes, yeah, we really still need you to do that. Please go on our behalf. And Esther ultimately makes the decision. She's going to go. And if I perish, I perish. And it's very much the energy that I'm sensing from Mr. Tumnus in this particular moment that kicks off the entire story. And so Lucy goes back through the wardrobe, and to her surprise, no time has passed. Now, the next part of this story is that Edmund, her next oldest brother, gets into Narnia too. She gets back and her siblings didn't believe her, obviously, and she was very upset. But a couple days later, they were playing hide and seek when it was raining, and she goes back to the wardrobe, and she gets back to Narnia. And it's bizarre. She's like, it didn't work when I tried to take my siblings before. It's working again. I'm just happy I'm here. So she goes off to see Mr. Tumnus. But the difference this time is that Edmund followed her. Now, Edmund had no good intentions about following her. He was going to make fun of her and pick on her, as sometimes older siblings do. But to his surprise, he also got into Narnia. But by the time he got in there, remember, time doesn't work the same way in Narnia, he couldn't find his sister. But he heard sleigh bells. Now remember, if there's no Christmas, sleigh bells don't mean anything positive. They're just kind of void of meaning. But Edmund hears sleigh bells and he thinks, oh, there's snow on the ground. Maybe it's Santa. I don't know. And he goes forward, and to his surprise, he sees this giant woman, over 7 feet tall. And she calls herself the Queen of Narnia, who we will refer to as the White Witch. And after talking with him for a little bit, it turns out that she realizes Edmund is not just any other creature in Narnia. He's actually what she calls a son of Adam, or a human. And so she begins to change her tone and starts being really nice. And she gives him these enchanted treats called Turkish delights. But assuming none of you know what that is, let's just call it chocolate for our sake. And Edmund, being a kid, he's really enjoying these chocolates. And not to mention, they're enchanted. And so on some level, these enchanted chocolates are so good that Edmund will do anything to get more of them. In fact, the way Lewis narrates it, it's the kind of enchantment that would make you go on eating this food, even if it were the thing that killed you. And so the witch makes a deal with Edmund and says, I want to meet your brothers and sisters, bring them back to my castle. Here's how to get to my castle. And if you do that, I'll reward you with even more of these Turkish delights or chocolates. And if you do that, then I'll make you the Prince of Narnia. And when I die, you can become the king. And Edmund's like, yeah, that seems like a pretty good deal. Just bring my siblings and things go well. The issue is there's this last piece that the queen adds. She says, make sure that you don't tell your siblings about meeting me. Keep it a surprise. And she also warns that fawns are known for telling strange, nasty stories and can't be trusted. And so apparently fake news was just as much an issue in Narnia as it is in our culture today. And that's the defense that the queen wanted to use to make sure that her ruse wasn't up yet. And so Edmund runs into his sister Lucy and they return together. But Lucy tells him about the White Witch. And Edmund, it didn't even take a moment for him to realize that the queen that he had just met was the White Witch. He was like, oh yeah, that's not good. And when he had heard that the lady he had made friends with was dangerous, the witch, he felt even more uncomfortable. But he still wanted to taste that Turkish delight again more than he wanted anything else. Remember, it was enchanted. Sometimes in our lives, there are things that we want so badly, we don't care who we hurt to get it, because we can't imagine our lives without getting the things that we want. Part of our created being, part of the intention behind the way we're created is that we are made with limits. Limits are not always bad things. Sometimes limits are there for our own benefit. And sometimes when we don't allow limits to do their work on us, we start to do things that we otherwise would never do for the sake of ourselves, rather than thinking about how it might impact those around us. Once again, we're seeing somewhere around the world now the consequences of people that don't know limits. But we also know that on a personal level too. All of us have been Edmund at some point. And so as the story continues, Edmund came up with this plan as he got back. He's like, I know I've got to lie to my other siblings. I have to say it was all pretend. Because if I don't, like my siblings, I can tell they're going to be on the side of the fawns and the animals. And even though I know the witch isn't all that good, she is going to give me the things that I want. And the narrator tells us that Edmund at this point was already more than halfway on the witch's side. And so the oldest siblings, Peter and Susan, decide they need to go talk to the old professor who owns the house. They need to get his help. And so they go and tell him about everything that's been happening with Lucy, that she's hallucinating this other world called Narnia. And the professor is quiet for a while, and he responds with this simple idea: how do you know that she's lying? And they go, well, she must be lying, right? Like, she's talking about going into another world, and we even checked the wardrobe. It didn't let us in. She's talking about talking animals. Like, what else could it be than a lie? And the professor says, well, a charge of lying against someone who we know doesn't lie is very serious. And he simply asks, who do you think is more trustworthy, Edmund or Lucy? They're like, well, definitely Lucy. That's what's so weird about it. The professor goes, oh, these kids, they never teach you logic in these schools anymore. Here's the situation. You've got three options. Either one, Lucy's lying, but we don't think she usually lies. Two, she's crazy. but she's not acting crazy in any other way. Or 3, she's telling the truth. Now, again, this is where Lewis is using this simple fiction to help plant some ideas that he thinks are really crucial to the way we talk about faith. So in Mere Christianity, the book we talked about earlier, there's this quote that Lewis puts in there when he's trying to lay out like what do Christians believe on the simplest level. And he's at a portion of the book where he's talking about whether or not people are willing to really accept who Jesus is. And he says, listen, I'm trying here to prevent anyone from saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him, being Jesus. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That's one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, on a level with the man who thinks he's a poached egg, or else he'd be a devil of hell. You must make your choice. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. So the parallel here is that Lucy about Narnia is either lying, crazy, or telling the truth. And Lewis elsewhere draws the connection that Jesus is either lying about being the Son of God as a demon, he's either crazy, a madman, or he's telling the truth. Now that might sound too simple, and in a lot of ways it is too simplistic, and to reduce the scenario down to that, because the obvious question is, well, let's just say he's telling the truth, or that Lucy's telling the truth. How? And the professor's response is, well, since the first 2 don't seem probable, we have to accept the difficult reality. It's probably the third option. And it's not really a question of why, but just accepting that in some mysterious way, that's what's happening. And so Peter and Susan leave, just like some of us probably would leave that conversation and go, okay, yeah, the old professor's probably crazy too. So a couple days go by and they are going through the corridors, and the house lady, Mrs. McCready, is very cranky all the time. And she's having this tour of people from around the area. And the kids are scared, so they go and they hide in the wardrobe. And to their surprise, they get into Narnia. And the moment they get into Narnia, they start arguing, and they're bickering as all good siblings do. And then it turns out it's revealed that Edmund did get to Narnia, and so he was lying. And so Peter, being the oldest sibling, and he rips into his younger brother and says, Edmund, this is totally unacceptable. And Edmund feels terrible, and then he's just reminded of the fact that he's going to be Prince of Narnia one day, so it doesn't really matter what Peter says. And so as they're sitting there, they try to go check on Mr. Tumnus, but then they are finding out that he's been arrested. They find a notice nailed to his door that he's been turned to stone for betraying the Queen of Narnia. And this is when Lucy reveals that this is no queen. She's a false queen. She's the White Witch. And so they decide they have to go help Mr. Tumnus. And in the middle of this, they see this robin that really seems like it wants them to follow them. Apparently, these 4 kids never learned you don't just follow strangers. I mean, Lucy followed around Mr. Tumnus without really knowing him, but in Narnia, I guess it's okay. So they start to follow this robin, and the robin leads them to the Beavers. The Beavers are very important characters. They'll come up again in future books. And so this is our first interaction with the Beavers, and they're conveniently named Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. And this is one of the reasons why we're not going to use any of the commentary from the movies. This is the old BBC movie that you can see here. Those are some terrifying looking beavers. I mean, when you look at what's going on there, it doesn't really look like the kids are having a good time. I mean, look at those faces. The live action works sometimes, and sometimes CGI is better. And so the beavers were much nicer. We're going to go with the newer version of the movie just for a visual aid there. But the Beavers are a major character, major 2 characters in the story, because they're the first characters to introduce these children and us to Aslan. And the language is, don't worry about the White Witch because Aslan is on the move. Perhaps he's already landed. I want to read a little quote to you from this moment, because I think, again, this is one of those moments that we import meaning to for ourselves. It says, and now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do. But the moment the beaver had spoken these words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it had sometimes happened to you in a dream where someone says something you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if it had some enormous meaning, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life and are always wishing you could get into that dream again. It was like that now. At the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump inside them. Edmund felt a sense of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got the feeling that you have when you wake up and realize it's the holidays or summer break. Just the name of Aslan alone invoked these feelings without them knowing anything about Aslan. And so, briefly, think about that. Think about a moment in your life, a memory where you've just experienced such surreal joy. Maybe it's an adventure or a special day like a wedding. Maybe it's listening to your favorite album with speakers right next to your head. Maybe it's learning about Narnia during Lent. Think about what one of those moments for you are where it just takes you to a different place. So that's what was going on with Aslan. And so this little dialogue unfolds. So the kids ask, who is this Aslan? Is he a man? And the beavers tell him, no, he's a lion. And the lions are pretty terrifying. Is he safe? And the beavers respond, if there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or they're just silly. And by silly, they mean stupid. But again, this is a children's novel and we don't want to use harsh language too much. So the kids clarify, then he isn't safe? And again, this is one of the famous lines of this series. Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. And one of our perceptions of God revolves around how safe God is. Maybe that's not the language that we always use, but when we talk about our faith in God, it's always a question of what is God doing in the world around me, and can I understand God enough to really believe this? But if we say that God is totally beyond us in the way that we think and act, and God is the pinnacle of compassion and knowledge, God knows all the things we can't know, he knows what's going to happen in the future, what's happened in the past, and we have to accept our finitude, which means we have to accept our imperfections and our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities. And as a result of that, it's really minimizing to us in some ways. But that's not the end of our perception of God, because at the same time, we're also saying that God is good. That's a core tenet of the faith that we share, that God's not just beyond us and powerful and smart and loving, compassion, all these things. It's God is good. Not good as in he pays his taxes on time. This ultimate, all-encompassing perspective of what good means. And so when we say that God is good, there's this paradox that creates this situation where the most terrifying and unsafe creature, being, person is somehow the safest place we can be. The most unsafe thing in our lives is also the thing that can give us the comfort that we want most. But that depends on us believing that God is good. And I think that's part of why Lewis used Aslan as the Christ figure in this series. Now, as this is all happening, Edmund has decided he wants no part of this. And so this is the story of Edmund's betrayal. As the Beavers are telling the kids about the prophecy, he leaves the room. What he doesn't hear is that there's been a prophecy since Narnia began, that 4 human beings, 2 boys and 2 girls, will come and rule as the kings and queens of Narnia. And when they get there, when they sit at the historic castle of Carapervel, then the White Witch's reign will end. But Edmund didn't hear that. What Edmund heard was there was Aslan, this lion that was going to overthrow the witch. And so he left, because again, the witch represented all that he wanted, to be better than his siblings and to get all of the delight that he could from candies and treats and being better than those that he didn't like. And so he left, and he searches for the witch's castle, as she already told him how to get there. And when the kids notice that Edmund's gone, Mr. Beaver says, yeah, I got the sense that he had a weird look in his eye, like someone that had been with the witch. It's something about their eyes. And again, this is something we can breeze over, but I think we all know what it looks like when someone in our lives has lost themselves to something else. When someone is searching for something to fulfill their greatest desires, that they give up everything else to their own detriment. Sometimes we become so fixated on the things we think will bring us joy, satisfaction, and meaning that we lose the things that matter to us most. And again, this is where Lewis's thought on these kinds of things are so impactful to me. There's a famous line that Lewis has in another work where he says, if I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical conclusion is that I was made for another world. When we search for our meaning and our joy in places that weren't intended to give them to us, it's going to be a tireless, endless search. That's the search Edmund was on right now. Edmund becomes the Judas of this story. Edmund becomes the one that leaves the inner circle, leaves the 12 disciples and Jesus to go and find his own way. Remember, Judas didn't leave Jesus to become a ruler in Rome. He left him for a little bit of silver. Certainly wasn't enough to retire on. There was something about that choice that lured Judas from the inner circle of Jesus enough. It's not like we plan for these moments to happen. It's when we're at our weakest and when we have succumbed to our deepest desires, or we've confused those desires, that we start to walk away from the very things that are in our lives for our good. And so Edmund goes and he gets to the witch's castle and he's telling her everything that happened. And in this moment, the narrator wants to make sure that we're aware that Edmund wasn't all that bad. He's a little kid, and really, he just wanted to get some Turkish delights and be a prince. And it wouldn't hurt so bad if he got to stick it to his siblings in the meantime. But he didn't want them to get turned to stone. He didn't know that was the witch's plan, or he didn't want to believe it anyways. But to his surprise, when he starts talking with the witch, she's furious. First, because he didn't bring his siblings with them. And now she's sure that his siblings are believing the lies of fauns and other creatures in Narnia. None of them can be trusted. Something about clinging to power makes you believe everyone's against you. And as Edmund quickly realizes, this queen is not too good. She's actually pretty terrible. And he quickly becomes her prisoner. And so she readies her sleigh, because she's going to go find Aslan before any of their plans can come to fruition. Now, in the meantime, the kids and the Beavers had left to go meet Aslan themselves. And as they're going, they're making a multi-day trek, trying their best to meet Aslan at the legendary stone table. And they stop to sleep overnight. And to their horror, they wake up one morning to sleigh bells. Remember, a winter without Christmas means sleigh bells are not good news. Sleigh bells are what announces the White Witch has arrived. But to their surprise, Mr. Beaver shouts out, "No, it's not her. You can come out now." And plot twist, Father Christmas arrives. Apparently, Lewis thought that's what we needed to shake this thing up. We needed Santa to come into the story. And the lines from Father Christmas are very interesting. He says, "I've come at last. She's kept me out for a long time, but I got in at last. Aslan is on the move. The witch's magic is weakening." Now, everyone gets a different gift, and they're very important in the story. Peter gets a sword and a shield because he's going to be the leader of the warriors. Susan gets a bow and arrow and a battle horn, and Lucy gets a small bottle of a healing elixir and a small dagger. She's the youngest. And when he leaves, he says something fascinating. "Merry Christmas and long live the true king." Now, if you don't know, Father Christmas, St. Nicholas, where we get the mythology of Santa Claus from, actually comes from a historical figure, and we call him St. Nicholas. And he was known for giving to people in need. And I think this is a moment, I haven't read this anywhere, but I would presume this is a moment where Lewis is trying to help right some of the wrongs of how Christmas has been recapitulated, to be focused not on Jesus, but on Santa and gifts. to say, no, like these things are not in contrast to one another, but have historically been in line with one another. Father Christmas in this story is a key character that is not there to replace the true king, but in fact is commanding to everybody to celebrate the reign of the living true king. And so I think in some ways, Lewis is giving a nod to how Christmas doesn't have to give up some of these traditions that we have while also recognizing them in their proper place. That's my hypothesis anyways. So from this moment, the spell is breaking. The queen takes her henchmen and Edmund, but as they're going to meet Aslan, they notice that the spell is breaking. The snow is melting. The trees are bursting forth. Greens and flowers and birds and creatures are coming out of the ground, and everyone is uneasy because it means the witch's power is not as strong as she thought. And so it's at this time that the other children reach the stone table. And as they do, they saw the great lion in the center of a great crowd of creatures. This is one of those beautiful moments where the power of our imaginations help import meaning into things that words can't capture. This is why poetry exists, right? You all know who Paul Revere is, but it's not because you read a book about Paul Revere. It's because there's a famous poem about Paul Revere. Sometimes art and our imagination can communicate truth in ways that mere facts can't. This is one of those moments. As Peter approaches Aslan, he explains that Edmund was with them, but he left for the witch's side. And in fact, Peter confesses it was partly his fault. He says, I was angry with him, and I think I helped him go the wrong way. And this response, and Aslan said nothing either to excuse Peter or to blame him, but merely stood looking at him with those great unchanging eyes. And it seemed to all of them that there was nothing to be said. This quiet moment where confession happens, acknowledgement of sin on some level happens, and we expect there to be a punishment. We expect to be, yeah, that's right, you were in the wrong, but no, there's a silence about it. There's a moment that we can't escape where, in this scenario, Peter's staring at Aslan's great unchanging eyes, and yet there's nothing else to be said. And it reminds me instantly of the story in John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery. And Jesus says, he who is without sin cast the first stone. And the final dialogue of that episode is, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? Sir, no one has. And Jesus said, neither do I condemn you. Go on your way, and from now on, do not sin again. Somehow in this moment with Jesus, there's a way to say, I don't condemn you, and also to say, don't go on doing the thing you were doing. Don't go on living the wrong way. It seems paradoxical, I think, because it is. There's some mysterious line between not condemning someone while also not condoning something. Something about that moment seems to speak to this moment with Peter and Aslan to me. The confession is there, but it's not something that's dwelled upon because grace and forgiveness are right there the entire time. In fact, when we talk about our faith and we talk about our shortcomings and our imperfections, we say in passages like Romans 5:8 that while we were still sinners, before any confession like this one ever happened, Christ died for us. Before we made it right, Christ loved and died for us. That's the kind of love Lewis is trying to communicate here with the Christ figure of Aslan. And so in the middle of the night, Aslan leads a mission to save Edmund. And he's saved from the witch's camp just a short couple 100 yards away. And he brings Edmund back. And when the kids get up, they realize that Aslan had been talking with Edmund. Now, up to this moment, Lucy was very concerned about what was going to happen. She says, Aslan, can anything be done? And Aslan's response again, in such a sweet way, is, all shall be done, but it'll be harder than you think. I think often we think we're left out on an island, but all will be done. It's just not always going to look the way that we think. And so on the one hand, the kids find out that Edmund had been saved. And on the other hand, they weren't really aware of what was going to happen next. it was going to be a bit different. And when Aslan had said this to Lucy, she had noticed, although he had seemed so royal and strong up to these moments, when he had said all shall be done, that it'll be harder than you think, he seemed sad as well. And this is really setting up the biggest tension of this story. As Aslan and Edmund are walking together and Aslan reintroduces Edmund to the group, he says, there's no need to talk about all the things that have been done in the past. And everyone reconciles. And again, that's just a brief reminder to me of stories like the prodigal son, where the prodigal son returns and the father meets him, not waiting for his full speech to be done of all the ways that he'll come back to make things right. No, he embraces him, kisses him, puts his robe upon him and his ring on his finger, and he throws a party because it's a time for celebration. The moment like that here, but it doesn't last very long, because shortly thereafter the witch arrives. And the witch argues that the deep magic of Narnia says that every traitor belongs to me as my lawful prey, and that for every treachery I have the right to kill those traitors. And even though it was a traitor for the other side, it still falls under her jurisdiction. And so Aslan went off for a while to talk with the witch alone, and when they returned, the witch renounced her claim over Edmund, and she left. And no one was really sure what happened, but Aslan instructed everyone to start packing up camp and to return home to prepare for the great battle, but that they were safe for now. Now, that night, things start to change. And this is where I think we get a glimpse of what I'd say is a Narnian Lent. So Lewis lays these things out. I just want you to think about the story of Jesus in Holy Week, what we celebrate, and what parallels you see for the next couple moments. Lucy and Susan couldn't sleep, and so they get up in the middle of the night and they notice Aslan walking alone. So they start to follow him. Of course, he notices and says, "Why are you following me?" They explain they couldn't sleep and they want to go wherever he goes. He says, "Well, I'll be glad to have company tonight. You may come, but you have to stop when I tell you to." They agreed. They were excited, but again, they noticed how sad he was and how low his head slumped. So Aslan is leaving in the night, somber. And as they approached the stone table, Aslan told the girls they had to hide away. It was time. And as they got there, there were all these great crowds of creatures with the White Witch waiting at the stone table. And Aslan submitted himself as the captive. And Lewis writes that they mocked him and jeered at him. They tied him up. Susan and Lucy held their breath, waiting for Aslan's roar and his victory against his enemies, but it never came. They bound him, they shaved him, they muzzled him, kicked him, spit on him, still jeering at him. And finally, just before the witch gave the final blow, she whispered to him, "Now who has won, you fool? Did you think by all this you would save that human traitor? Now I will kill you instead of him, as our pact was, and so the deep magic will be appeased. But when you're dead, what will stop me from killing him as well? Understand that you've given me Narnia forever, for you have lost your own life, and you have not saved his. In that knowledge, despair and die." And Aslan dies. And this is the moment that we talk about in our faith in so many different ways. That's why we have crosses everywhere to remember the death of the king we thought was going to save us. The crucifixion. And so this Narnian Lent continues. The witch and her people, they celebrate and they ready for battle, so they leave. And from there, Lucy and Susan go to Aslan's body and they remove the muzzle and they wipe the blood from his mouth, trying to give him some dignity in his death. And they notice that things just don't feel right. The narrator writes in some bleak ways that this moment, it was more lonely and hopeless and horrid than I know how to describe. I hope no one who reads this book has ever been quite as miserable as Susan and Lucy were that night. But if you have been, if you've been up all night and cried until you have no more tears left in you, you'll know that in the end there comes a sort of quietness. You feel as if nothing was ever going to happen again. That was the bleakness of the darkness of seeing your dreams die. But that's not where the story ends. Just like we parallel the rest of the story of Lent, the journey through darkness, we also parallel the resurrection. And so Lucy and Susan hear a great crack, and they worry that the witch has returned to do something to Aslan again. But to their surprise, they notice that Aslan is standing there on the stone table that's been cracked down the center as the sun rises, paralleling the curtain in the temple being torn from top to bottom. Again, the imagery here is pretty rich with the faith that we espouse. And so they ask, "Aren't you dead, dear Aslan?" And he says, "Not now." He says, "You're real, you're not a ghost, but what does it mean?" And Aslan says, "Well, it means that though the witch did know some things about the deep magic, there's a magic deeper still that she didn't know about. Her knowledge only goes back to the beginning of time," which, okay, shame on her. She didn't study before the beginning of time. But if she could have looked a little further into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation, and she would have known that when a willing victim who's committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backwards. This is the good news of the gospel, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. But this mystery of this death somehow making things right, of making death work backwards, the Christianese language we use for this is called the atonement. And what the atonement is an attempt at making sense of how this all works. And this is where we can use logic until logic has to get off the train. There's something to the story of the atonement. There's something to the story of Christ's death and resurrection on our behalf that is beautiful while mysterious, that changes everything for us, but it can't be explained in simple terms. That's what Lewis is trying to give us a glimpse of in this moment. And so they celebrate. They start jumping around, and they get ready to go liberate the people that the witch has already taken into captivity. And so Lucy and Susan ride Aslan to the witch's castle, and they arrive and they see the statues there, the prisoners, and Aslan starts to run and to breathe on them. And as he does, they start to melt from their stone and animate again. Remember, the season of Lent, from dust we came, to dust we will return, but it's God who breathes life into the dust that gives life to humanity. In fact, the name Yahweh is very much connected to the notion of breathing. Somehow God's very essence is what makes life possible. Aslan breathes on these statues and liberates them from this captivity, and they take this newfound army to go join the battle. And when they arrive, they make quick work of the queen. Aslan ends the war, and they realize that there's been a lot of casualties. The focal point of this story is not some great battle, but rather the relationship between Aslan and the people of Narnia. And when they notice the casualties in this battle, it's Edmund, actually, of all people, who kept the battle going. It's Edmund who sacrificed himself to make sure the witch couldn't turn anyone else to stone by destroying her wand. And as he was at death's door, Lucy goes and saves him with her elixir given to her from Father Christmas. Edmund, the Judas of this story, is a picture of what redemption can look like if we have the capacity to pursue it. If we have the ability to humble ourselves and receive grace and forgiveness, it's always there. And Edmund is a beautiful character, especially moving forward in these stories, that shows us that none of us are beyond redemption. And so from here, they go to the famous castle of Cara Paravel, and the four kids are crowned, and they rule for a long, long time. But as the celebrations are going on, Aslan's on the move again. Mr. Beaver reminds the children, yeah, he'll be coming and going. One day you'll see him, and another you won't. He doesn't like being tied down. Of course, he's got other countries to tend to, but that's quite all right. He'll often drop in. Only you mustn't press him on it. He's wild. He's not like a tame lion. A lot of human history has been tied to some detrimental moments where people have tried to tame God, have tried to make God in their own image, who have tried to utilize God as a way to justify their actions. But our God is not tameable. Anytime you find human people groups trying to use God as an excuse for whatever they do, it's usually an indicator that they're trying to tame this wild lion. But Aslan's on the move. God is already at work in other places. And so that the children accept this reality, that somehow to be in relationship with Aslan means to accept that he's going to be coming and going as he pleases. One of the difficult parts of our faith is when we're looking for God and feel that he's not on the move with us, that he's not meeting us where we are, that he's not taking care of us when we need it most. But the story that we find in Lent is that through the darkest moments that Jesus endured, he still pursued what God had laid out. But in the darkest moments, that there is still light. The parallel of Lent and Aslan's journey here is that even when the darkness seems to win, that God is still working and that there is still good. We just have to trust that God is good. Even though he's not safe and he's not tame, he's good. And so the story concludes with the kids ruling in Narnia for decades. And because it's the final chapter of the book, we throw in an extra little mysterious adventure to chase a white stag, who apparently, if you catch him, can grant wishes. And so they're all out searching for this old white stag, and they stumble upon an old lamppost. And as they explore that lamppost, they walk through the trees and find themselves amongst some coats and fall out of the wardrobe again. And there they are. No time had passed. And so they go and they tell the professor about everything that had happened, frankly, because they wanted to apologize for stealing his coats. And he reminded them they're going to be able to return to Narnia again, but it's going to be from a different way. He says, don't try going the same route twice. Indeed, don't try to get there at all. It'll happen when you're not looking for it. And this is only the beginning of their adventures in Narnia. Sometimes when we've had experiences in our faith, we try to recreate them. If only I could feel the way I did back then I'll be in a good place again. But that's not how life works. We have to move forward and look for the new ways God is working amongst us and the new ways that God's inviting you into the work. There's a lot of darkness that seems to prevail in the world around us, but the story of Narnia is a reminder that all of us have the capacity to work with Christ in building the kingdom here. We're not making it ourselves. And he's not leaving us on our own, but rather leading us forward in that work. So next week, we will continue by going to the next story, which is Prince Caspian. And we will see where the new adventures take us and what Aslan has in store. Thank you, guys.